Hello everyone again. This is going to be the video for chapter 5. Now, if you look, you will see that chapter 5 is split into two different PowerPoint lessons, but I'm going to do them both in this one video instead of doing two separate videos. So this first part is over chapter 5, part 1 PowerPoint. And this is what's going on in the colonies before we have the American Revolution. So if you remember, chapter 4, we talked about the French and Indian War, which was that part of the war that took place in North America. It was part of a larger war known as the 7 Years' War, but the part in North America was the French and Indian War. And for the colonists, the whole goal of fighting this war with France was so that they could get land that would be west of the Appalachian Mountains. However, they quickly realized that's not what the British government had in mind after the war was being fought. So after the war is over and Britain is trying to now decide what's going to happen with the territory that they own, because they received most of the territory that existed between Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. And the problem is the British government is pretty much broke after that war is over, because they had just not only fought North America, but they had fought all over the world with a whole bunch of different nations. So they were almost bankrupt. And they needed a way to kind of get money back for that. And one of the ways they came up with that was, of course, to tax the colonies, which the colonists did not like that very much. They also wanted to tighten control of the colonies, because the colonies had been under salutary neglect for about 70-ish years. And now the British government was like, no, we got to nip that in the bud. We got to remind them who's boss. They got to start paying taxes and pay for this war that we fought on their behalf, and so on and so forth. Plus, we got to get some money somehow, so let's just tax the colonists. And of course, the colonists didn't like that very much. Another thing they did is that they drew a line, pretty much. It was called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And this line ran across the Appalachian Mountains, more or less. And what they said was that now the colonists are not supposed to settle west of that line. And that made the colonists very upset, because they thought they fought the war in order to get land west of that line. That's the reason they were fighting the French to begin with. So once that line was drawn, the colonists were not supposed to settle on the other side of it. And of course, that didn't happen. The colonists, being the colonists, started to set up their own forts across that line anyway. And you can see that on slide 5, that proclamation line of 1763, and the fact that there were forts and other things being set up on the other side of it, because the colonists didn't really listen. But other things, and the other reason was that the British government realized that if the colonists keep getting more and more land, then they can start setting up their own industries, especially the manufacturers industry, like furniture and things like that, where they could start creating products that they normally buy from Britain, and that would cut down on the revenue that Britain gets, and they didn't want that to happen. So that's another reason they didn't want the colonists settling across the Appalachian Mountains in particular. So they were trying to cut down on that. It didn't work so well. But then George Grenville becomes prime minister in 1763, and he's like, okay, these colonists really have to understand what's going on here. So he gets Parliament and the king to start passing some of these things that we call acts. Many of these, if you think of them, they're mostly taxes. One of them was the Sugar Act of 1764. So, about the Sugar Act. Technically, it was a decrease in the amount of taxes that would be paid on sugar. And also molasses. Molasses was used to make rum, so if you want to keep that in mind. But anyway, so The problem with it is that the colonists had not been paying the taxes on sugar or molasses anyway, because they had been smuggling in their own sugar and molasses. So, but now with the Sugar Act, the British government were going to put royal agents in charge of collecting these taxes. So it was more government oversight to make sure the taxes were going to be paid. And that was the big problem. And what really made colonists upset about it was now that they were going to have to pay the taxes, even if they were considered lower, they hadn't been paying them before. So they didn't want to pay it now either. And it also taxed other things that hadn't been taxed before, like indigo, pimento, which was an allspice, wines, and coffee. Now, indigo, if you don't know what that is, it is a plant that's used to make a dye. And this dye is like a purplish bluish color. And that color was a symbol of royal status or elite status, so it was often used to dye clothing. So it was very popular. And the colonists didn't want that to be another thing taxed either, so they were upset about that. The Quartering Act of 1765 also made the colonists upset, because what this said is now that you colonists have to feed and house the British troops that we're assigning over there. So you have to find, room in your house for them to sleep, you have to feed them, you have to clean up after them, and so on and so forth. And the colonists didn't want to do that either, so most of them just ignored that. They didn't follow that. But the one that really upset them was the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act pretty much required that you were going to have to pay a tax on paper products. And most of these were official papers like diplomas, marriage license, wills, things like that. But any type of paper, official paper, like a newspaper or playing cards, you would have to pay this tax. Why that was a problem was, in particular, newspapers, you have multiple pages usually in a newspaper. Each page would have to have that stamp, so you would have to pay the tax on each page. Which could get very, very expensive if you want your newspaper to be popular and being sent out and everything. Same thing with playing cards. Like if you think of a pack of cards today, they have like 52 to 54 cards in the pack, but each one of those would have had to have that stamp. So it can get very, very expensive, and that made the colonists very upset. So they were not really wanting to follow that. So, and on slide 9 is a picture of the stamp itself that would have had to go on each paper. So the colonists got together and they started to decide that this is not going to happen. We're not going to allow this to happen. So they created what was called the Stamp Act Congress, where they all got together and talked about, what the response was going to be. They also sent out circular letters letting the other colonies know thoughts and things like that to discuss it, really. These were illegal, actually. They weren't really supposed to meet and discuss these things, but they did it anyway. It was called the Stamp Act Congress. They met in New York City in October 1765. 9 colonies sent representatives. And they started to also discuss this idea that Parliament should not be allowed to tax the citizens or tax the citizens without the citizens having some say in it. Most of the blame was laid on Parliament, not the king, though, because they thought it was Parliament the one passing these acts, so it was their fault. And they also started to mount a response to them, and one of the responses was boycotts. Most of the boycotts were peaceable. What it was mostly women, but men too, but the women were known as Daughters of Liberty. They got together and they started to boycott certain things that had been imported from Britain before. Cloth and tea were 2 of the main ones, and tea was a big thing to boycott that because they were still very English in nature and they loved to drink their tea. So it said something that they were boycotting tea. But cloth was another thing. So instead of buying cloth from Britain, they started to spin their own cloth, and they had spinning bees. And some of the prominent women that we later learn about, Abigail Adams, who was John Adams' wife, and Deborah Sampson Franklin, who was Benjamin Franklin's wife, they were leaders of these Daughters of Liberty. who helped with this effort to stop the acts from being implemented. They did effectively shut down the port in New York. British imports declined. That meant the revenue that the British government was getting declined, so that caused a lot of problems for the government over there. Now, that was the peaceable protests. The non peaceable protests, especially by the Sons of Liberty, which was a very riotous group, and they had very prominent names like Samuel Adams. You probably heard of him. He has his own beer today named after him, Samuel Adams, you know. Paul Revere was one of them, John Hancock. All of those started out in the Sons of Liberty. And they were more than willing to not be peaceable in their protesting. So they did riot often. They gathered mobs, especially in Massachusetts. Boston was one of the major cities where a lot of this stuff happened. But in other colonies too, New York, Rhode Island, South Carolina, they went to the homes of the stamp officials who were supposed to be collecting that tax when it came in. And the tax, the Stamp Act was put forward in March of 1765. But it was not supposed to go into effect until November 1st of 1765. So the colonists, once they got word of this, they had plenty of time to organize these movements. And that's what they did. So this stuff happened. They started burning the homes of those officials who were supposed to collect the tax. They also created cloth dolls that had the faces, the pictures of the stamp officials on them, and they hung them outside of those officials' homes to give them the fear factor of, hey, this is what's going to happen to you if you think you're going to collect this tax on us. But the most brutal one that they did was they tarred and feathered the officials. And we see tarring and feathering in cartoons all the time, and we think, ha ha ha, that's so funny, tar and feather, you know. But if you really think about what it means to tar and feather, they poured hot, boiling tar onto a person, and that tar adheres to the person's skin. And then they put feathers on top of that. So once that tar dries, and when you try to go to remove the feathers or get the tar off of your skin is actually stuck to it. So you end up pulling your skin off in the process. And you end up with severe burns all over your entire body. That's just how brutal tarring and feathering really was. It was pretty awful. It's not really a funny thing, although it's depicted as being funny today. So it's pretty awful. And because of that, most of the stamp officials, they resigned before November 1st of 1765. I didn't sign up for this. This is not what I was looking into or to try to do this job. And then the crown's like, hey, anybody else want this job? You come over and you can be the collector who's going to collect. And surprisingly enough, nobody wanted that job. I wonder why. So they had no one who was going to actually collect the tax on the Stamp Act on November 1st, 1765. So that was a big problem. And you can see a depiction on slide 12 of the tarring and feathering. It was a horrible process, so it's not really funny, even though it's depicted as funny. Okay, so those were the boycotts and the rioting. There were some, especially John Adams was one, who wanted to peaceably resolve these issues, and they wrote letters to Parliament called resolves, in which they are encouraging and expressing, their desire to change these peaceably, but their desire that these acts should be repealed, so on and so forth. But the ones who were more peaceable and were wanting to use their intellect to change things were called radical Whigs. And that name had been adopted because the Whigs in England had been the ones who were trying to get things changed in England, so it just was adopted over here as radical Whigs. But that name later sticks, and we'll hear more about it when we talk about actual American history. We haven't got to that part yet. But anyway, These radical Whigs came up with the motto that spurs the American Revolution: the no taxation without representation. That people should not be taxed without first having voted on the taxes. So that's why they said no taxation without representation, and that becomes a huge issue. And many people wrote different documents about it. John Adams, his was called Instructions. He said that private property, personal liberty, these are being threatened by Parliament if they tax the colonists, especially without the colonists voting on it. So you're not really considered free if Parliament can seize your property at any point or give you a trial without a jury of your peers being present, and so on and so forth. So he was basically arguing against any types of taxes. Benjamin Franklin and Daniel Delaney, they kind of took a more moderate approach, saying, no, up until this point, we've given Parliament pretty much has had the right to tax trade because they've always had the right to do that. So that's external taxes. But now they're trying to tax the regular everyday people, and that's internal taxes. And we shouldn't let them do that instead. But most of the colonists wanted to agree with John Adams at this point and said, no, Parliament shouldn't be able to tax us at all without our consent. Doesn't matter if it's external, internal, whatever. And then there were people who were considered the opposition to the opposition. They were very loyal to the British government and thought that Parliament has always had the power to, Parliament and the British government has always had the power to make laws concerning the people that live there. So they are all powerful, so we shouldn't go against them. And one of them was Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, Massachusetts. He was one of those that was encouraging the colonies, to follow what Parliament had said. But the rioters, especially the Sons of Liberty, had targeted him because of that. And they burned down his house and all of his possessions. And after that, he does become a staunch loyalist because of the treatment he received. So then these issues have reached the ear of Parliament across the sea. And now they're weighing in on the subject. And they're saying, Parliament, especially in the House of Commons, which is the body of Parliament that represents all, pretty much, it has virtual representation. So the people who make up the House of Commons are supposed to have the ability to make laws for all of the king's subjects, whether they're voted on or appointed or whatever. Because there are even some areas within England itself that do not have representatives, or the representatives are appointed instead of elected officials. So that is virtual representation. But the colonists are saying, no, we call for deputy representation, meaning that we actually get to vote on our representatives, and those representatives get to vote on whether we get taxed or not. So that was the issue going back and forth between them. But with all this being said, because of the boycotts and things like that, trade was really not going well with Britain and they were losing money. So the king was like, I'm not having any part of this. So he withdraws his support for the Stamp Act. And Parliament then repeals it, not because they wanted to capitulate to the colonists, but because they were siding with the king. But then they passed the Declaratory Act that told the colonists, listen, just because we repealed the Stamp Act doesn't mean y'all won. We still have the right to pass any law that we want to because we are Parliament and that is our job. The colonists just pretty much ignored that Declaratory Act and went on celebrating the fact that the Stamp Act was repealed. That didn't last very long, though, because Charles Townshend becomes the Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1766, and he realizes that the colonies are having way too much freedom, and they need to be put in their place, and recognize that the British government is all-powerful, whether they like it or not. So he passes the Restraining Act, which basically suspends New York's assembly their ability to have self-government because they were not complying with the Quartering Act. They were not housing soldiers and feeding them and so on and so forth. So they were, being colonists, what they normally do, and ignoring the law. So he's like, no, we really got to cut down on this. So he passes other acts called the Townshend Acts of 1767, and pretty much what these are is that he's like, okay, the colonists say we can only tax trade. Well, let's do that. Let's tax every single item that we sell to them. How about that? So, most of the items like glass, lead, which was used for paint at the time, tea, paper, pretty much anything that was being traded to the colonies was going to be taxed now. And so that was pretty much the end of salutary neglect, and the colonists were very unhappy about that. And they did the same thing. They started boycotting the goods just because they didn't want to pay the tax. So women stopped wearing silks and satins. They no longer were using wine or tea. And that, once again, was cutting down trade for Britain. And there were other things that were being written and passed on and so on and so forth. But things started to heat up after that. They were no longer being, mild, even though the tar and feathering is not mild, but they started to get a lot more tense, especially in Boston, once again in Massachusetts. The circular letters were still being passed around, giving everyone the ideas. Samuel Adams was still, pushing the boycotting and rioting. John Hancock, too. So John Hancock was trying to smuggle in some wine aboard the ship, the Liberty, because he wasn't going to pay the tax. There were warrants already being issued for Samuel Adams and John Hancock for questioning and their motives, I guess. So officials were supposed to be arresting them whenever they saw them, but the colonists held those officials at bay so that John Hancock and his crew could unload the ship, and take off the wine without paying any of the duties, and then he was not arrested. So more troops are sent in to Boston in particular, but New York as well and other cities by 1770. And that just heightens tensions more now because there are British troops around. There's a huge British presence in the colonies, the troops' presence in the colonies, so that's agitating people. So on March 5th, 1777, a crowd of people, pretty much a mob, gets together because they see some troops standing outside of a building, some British troops standing outside of a building, and they're going to go up and harass them. And you get differing stories about what happened in this event. The British say, they were just standing. Well, let's go with the colonists. The colonists say they just met to peaceably protest the fact that there were British troops there and so on and so forth, and they were just doing, their duty as British citizens to let their voices be heard. But the British troops, on the other hand, said there was a huge group of people that were surrounding us, and they had guns, they had pitchforks, they were throwing rocks at us, they were throwing snowballs at us. This was not a peaceable protest, this was a mob. They were there, to fight. And once again, what it really becomes murky about what happens. Possibly there was a shot that rang out and someone yelled fire. It's not sure which side yelled fire, but what happened was the British troops opened fire on the crowd and killed 5 people. Killed 5, wounded 6 others, and the event then after that point was labeled the Boston Massacre. Although, 5 people being killed, not technically a massacre, although 5 people were killed, but the whole thing, it just started to be a propaganda message being sent around to the other colonies that, look, this is what the troops are here to do. They're here pretty much to kill us all. And Paul Revere himself created an image, and you'll see that image on slide 19 of the event, calling it the Boston Massacre. And you've probably heard of Paul Revere before. But the issue with this picture is that it already starts to distort events even more. First, it shows the British troops just firing on, what looks like a peaceable group. Um, Second was that the first person who was killed in this mob was Crispus Attucks. And Crispus Attucks, why is he important? Is because that he possibly was a mixed ancestry, African and Native American ancestry. So he was not white. But he was a free colonist who was there in the mob protesting the British just like the other colonists. And in fact, the mob itself was not just all white men. It was made up of many different races. There were Native Americans there were Africans there, mixed ancestry. All were part of this mob who were protesting what the British were doing, what the British government was doing. But Paul Revere didn't put that in his picture. He put it as a whole bunch of white men, and especially that first person as a white person who was shot and killed. So Crispus Attucks has been called the first martyr of the American Revolution because he was the first one killed during the Boston Massacre, but also his identity was nearly erased because Paul Revere thought that it would take away from the message if it was shown that other people besides white men were involved in this. But with that being said, I went to Boston last year, around this time, in fact, and in the cemetery that still exists that has many of these prominent men, Samuel Adams being one, but Samuel Adams, right after the massacre, had a monument erected with the names of the people who were killed in the massacre, and he made sure to put Crispus Attucks' name on it to commemorate him and his death. So at least someone was trying not to erase that person. Anyway, after this, though, with different events happening, the British really trying to tighten control, lots of things, there were committees of correspondence created specifically to start sending out letters and those circulated letters and newspapers and all kinds of stuff to make sure the colonies were aware of the events going on. And that spread the ideas and really got things started as far as rebellion is concerned, not revolution yet, because a lot of the colonists were not really wanting to go against the British government. They wanted to just reconcile the differences and everyone be happy and go back to the way things were. But then another act is passed, of course, in 1773, the Tea Act. So Parliament passes it, and once again, technically, it is a decrease in the tax on tea. But once again, the colonists had not been paying the tax on tea because they had been smuggling in Dutch tea or Chinese tea or whatever tea they had wanted to drink at that time. So they hadn't been paying the tax to begin with. But now, once again, they were going to have to, because what the Tea Act did was it put the East India Company in charge of the tea trade. And it said that no other merchants were allowed to be involved in the tea trade. So only East India Company officials could sell tea to the colonies. And there would be royal agents placed to collect that tax to make sure it was being paid. So now the smuggling would be cut down because regular everyday merchants couldn't sell tea. It had to be someone who was approved by the British government. And that meant a lot of merchants lost their jobs, and it gave a monopoly to the East India Company. So that really upset the colonists because now their rights, their, not pursuit of happiness, but their property and so on and so forth, their life and liberty, everything was being infringed upon. So the colonists were very upset, and were going to, in some way, try to stop this. So they mounted protests, of course, and then they decided they just weren't going to pay the tax on tea. So when the ships were coming in, they were sending them back to England without paying any taxes on them. And this was going to happen again in Boston. Here we go back with Boston. But at the time, this time, Thomas Hutchinson was now governor of Boston because of his loyalty to the British government. He had been upgraded to governor, and his son was one of the consignees that were supposed to collect that tax. So Hutchinson decided he didn't want to anger the British government, so he was going to go ahead and pay the tax on the tea. And the tax had to be paid on December 17th, 1773. So that's when he was going to pay it. Well, the colonists heard that he was going to go ahead and pay this tax when they didn't want to. So they had a meeting beforehand and organized what they were going to do. So on the night of December 16th, 1773, anywhere from 60 to 100 colonists, all dressed as Mohawk Indians, went and dumped that tea into the ocean, and into Boston Harbor. Samuel Adams, we have a lot of evidence points that he was the main instigator of this event, known as the Boston Tea Party. However, they did hide their identity well. We'll never know exactly who was there, but we're pretty sure he was there. But they went aboard these ships and dumped 342 large chests of tea into the water. And that equals about $1 million in today's money. Now, imagine $1 million is a lot of money today. Well, imagine how much it was back then. That was a huge amount of money. And now it's just like taking $1 million and throwing it into the water, and you can't use it anymore because the British government can't sell that tea anywhere else now. So it just completely destroyed that property. And so after that, the British government decided these aren't any more passive protests or peaceable protests. They're pretty aggressive. We've got to cut down on this. This isn't going to happen. So, 1774, they passed what's called the Coercive Acts to try to get these colonists back in line. The colonists didn't like these acts at all, so they called them the Intolerable Acts. So if you see coercive, or they're the same thing as the Intolerable Acts. And there were 4 of them majorly, and the 5th was kind of a separate portion, but it was added on. So the first one was the Boston Port Act. It closed Boston Harbor, not allowing any ships in or out until the tea was paid for. That effectively shut down the trade of Boston, and that was not good for Boston or Massachusetts. The second was the Massachusetts Government Act that said the colonists could no longer hold their own assemblies. They were not allowed to have their own self-government anymore. The third, the Administration of Justice Act, said that any British officials who were charged with a crime would no longer be tried in the colonies. They were pretty much tried back in Britain, which means, or by British officials, which means they really were not going to be charged with crimes anymore. The Quartering Act, now that was just an extension of the Quartering Act that already existed, but this one said now the British troops can confiscate any building that they want and use it as a barracks. So what they started to do was confiscated the merchants' warehouses and use them as barracks. So not only did they get the building, but everything that was inside of the building became their property. So all the goods that the merchants were supposed to be selling, to make a living, became the property of the British government, and that made them very upset. And then the last part, the Quebec Act. What that said was that the French Canadians now could practice Roman Catholicism, and the Protestant colonists didn't like this. But it said that the holdings that England had that were west of the Proclamation Line, meaning on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, now the officials in Quebec are in charge of controlling that area. And that made the colonists really mad because now not only can they not access that land now, but someone else has control of it. Whereas the British government, who's all the way across the sea, has control of them. So they did not like that at all. So, once again, the goal of these coercive acts were to try to get the colonists in line and it was trying to cut off Massachusetts from the rest of the colonies to put down this so-called little rebellion that was going on. It didn't happen though, because most of the colonies just came to the aid of Massachusetts. They sent them goods and food in particular and other stuff, so that didn't happen. And then the colonists decided they're going to get together and talk about what they're going to do about this. So they hold the First Continental Congress in May of 1774. And then in September 12th is when they sent representatives to meet. So they were discussing, what they planned to do with that. And during this time, they also created the Declaration of Rights, which asserted that they had the rights of, especially colonists, had the rights of life, liberty, and property. The goal of the First Continental Congress, though, once again, was not to break away from the British government, but they were seeking autonomy, not independence. Now, autonomy means you're still part of the overall British government, British Empire, but you kind of have your own self-governments and things going on. So you acknowledge that you are part, you still have oversight from the British government, but you're separate from it. It's not independence, it's autonomy. At the same time, though, the colonists start to think ahead. They start to create a militia, and they start to train this militia, started to train their soldiers, and stockpile weapons, just in case things escalate a little bit more. And the British government gets word that they are doing this, so they start to send more troops over. And in September 1774, an unfortunate event happens. A rumor gets circulated in the colonies that the British government's on their way to confiscate some of these stockpiles and things. And this is called the powder alarm. It was not true, but because there were about 3,000 colonists who went to try to stop that from happening, even though it wasn't true. And in particular, Governor Thomas Gage saw what was happening and sent that information over to the British government saying, hey, they have enough people and they're starting to, amass an army and some weapons and stuff. So the British government was like, now we really got to stop this. So they sent more troops over, and they were going to go to one of the training facilities in Concord. If you go up north, that's what they call it, Concord. Down here, we're like Concord, but up there's Concord. So the goal was to go there to capture those supplies and arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who were supposedly there, and they were. And now here comes one of the myths that are established. Paul Revere in particular, if you've ever heard, the British are coming, the British are coming. So what happens with that story is that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem, and he wrote this poem almost 100 years after the American Revolution, and he was looking for a word that rhymes with here, and he was talking about Paul Revere. So that's how Paul Revere becomes famous, for his long ride to warn the colonists that the British are coming. And there's several things wrong with that. What is wrong with it? There were actually 3 people who were going to warn the others. Paul Revere was one of them, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott. Paul Revere is captured before he actually makes it to the end of the trip. William Dawes has to run off so that he won't be captured. But it is actually Samuel Prescott who makes it all the way to Concord to warn the colonists. And he was not warning the colonists that the British are coming, because at the time, the colonists were still considered British. So they would not have said, the British are coming. But this was written, by an American almost 100 years later. So at that time, we signified that we were American and they were British. But at the time, that 1775, they would not have said the British are coming. But anyway, so if you want to read that poem, it's called Paul Revere's Ride, and it's good, interesting poem, although it's factually incorrect. Anyway, so on April 18th, 1775, the troops are moving towards Concord. The Minutemen, which are the militia that had been created, and they're called Minutemen because they're supposed to be ready on a minute's notice. They go to Lexington, which is just before Concord, to head off the troops from getting to Concord. However, they are defeated at that point. Shots are fired. 8 colonists were killed, 10 were wounded, only 1 British soldier was killed. But that first skirmish at Lexington was called the Shot Heard Around the World, because it pretty much signified that the war had begun. Anyway, so the British start to march on to Concord. John Hancock and Samuel Adams had already fled so that they would not be captured. But there's pretty much one bridge to get into Concord. So what happens is the colonists set up on one side of the bridge and hold off the British. They just keep firing so that the British can't cross that bridge. And then the British retreat. So the militia, the Minutemen, follow them, and there are other militia, Minutemen, hidden along the way who are shooting from trees and firing and so on and so forth, so that the Redcoats, as they are called, have to go all the way back to Boston. And the casualties of this Concord, is the 95 casualties. That means wounded and dead, not just dead. But the British had 273 casualties, and 73 of them were deaths. So they soundly lost that little skirmish. And on slide 28, you will see the map showing that trek from Boston to Concord and back again, and also where Revere, Dawes, and Prescott ended up and made it, and so on and so forth. So after that, by May 10th, 1775, there's a Second Continental Congress, again in Philadelphia. In that Congress, they form an official Continental Army, and they assign General George Washington to be the leader. They're still not trying to break away from the British government, though. They draft, in July of that year, an olive branch petition, still trying to tell King George III, hey, we don't want to fight with you. Can we still peaceably resolve this? But King George III pretty much ignores that anyway. And then before that olive branch petition sent out, there's another battle. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. And we consider the Battle of Bunker Hill the first all-out battle of the Revolutionary War. Even though most of the fighting actually takes place on Breed's Hill, which is the next hill over. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. Hey, whatever. Within that battle, even though the Patriots lose, for the most part, the British lost 1,000 men in an hour, but they killed 400 Minutemen. But after the battle, more and more colonists decide to join the war effort and join the militia. Parliament, though, declares that the colonies are now in open rebellion. They issue the American Prohibitory Act, that closes any ports of America, so they blockade all the ports. No ships in or out. Any ships that are making their way around that area are subject to be boarded, the goods confiscated, and the crew killed to put down that rebellion. So that at that point, the rebellion turns to revolution because the colonists mount their own response to it. And that was part 1. Now, part 2. Before I say anything about part 2, there's 2 things that needs to be discussed. First of all, we call it the American Revolution. And in a way, it was revolutionary, but as far as revolutions go, it was not as much as a revolution as, say, the French Revolution or Haiti and so on and so forth. Because even though we win, a lot of the stuff that goes on in America was still pretty much British in nature, and I'll talk more about that later. The second thing is, I'm going to ask a very specific question, and many of you are going to come up with an answer that you think is correct, and you are wrong. But that's okay, because it's not your fault. So the question is, when did the United States become a nation? And the answer you're probably thinking is July 4th, 1776, which is wrong. But that's okay. Once again, it's not your fault. It is the day that we celebrate as our independence, because that's when the Declaration of Independence was signed. However, if you're really wanting to answer that question correctly, the United States does not become a nation until September 3rd of 1783, because we have to fight an entire war known as the American Revolution in order to be an independent nation. So we did not actually become a nation until 1783, not 1776. So there's some fun facts for you. All right. So what's going on in America now? After the Battle of Bunker Hill and all this other stuff going on, is that skirmishes are breaking out pretty much everywhere. Especially in the West, there's stuff going on. Some of the militias start to capture forts that are being held by the British troops. Like one is Fort Ticonderoga and then Crown Point. Why do I say Fort Ticonderoga? Because when I was in elementary school, we watched a video about that particular battle going back and forth, because the British eventually take it back. But the narrator, whenever he said that, would say Fort Ticonderoga. So that always stuck in my head. So now I have to say it that way. I don't know why. But anyway, so in Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, he is pretty much ousted and tries to get away, but he tries to turn the tide in his favor. So he says, any slaves who fight on the side of Britain will be freed. And this is called the Liberty to Slaves Initiative that the British government adopts, and that causes many, many slaves to join this effort, the American Revolution effort. So, and many of them fought on the side of the British because they thought they would eventually get freedom if the British won. Later on, George Washington also has slaves fight, although freedom is not technically a deal, but slaves fight on both sides of the American Revolution. The British government also starts to take their initiatives. They hire what's called Hessians. These are German mercenaries who were, pretty much mercenaries for hire, who will fight your wars for you if you pay them enough. You may have heard of the word Hessian before, if you've heard of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, because in the American version of that tale, the headless horseman was a Hessian who had lost his head during the American Revolution by a cannon that had shot it off. So that's where you may have heard that before. If not, well, now you know. So a lot of the opinion in America, or what would become America, is turning against the British at this point. Some were still loyal, though, because they still had connections in Britain, family, friends, stuff like that. They still had economic ties to Britain. Excuse me. Some were afraid that another country would take over and what would happen to them then. Others thought, well, what's going to happen to our religion if another nation takes over or someone else takes over? And also, Britain was considered the strongest empire in the world at that point. So a lot of people thought, there's no way we can win this war anyway. Why would we support you crazy people? But there was this new idea at the time that was starting to be pushed forward, and it's called republicanism. And that is the idea that government should be based on the consent of the governed. People have a duty to ensure the government doesn't infringe upon the individual rights, and those are life, liberty, and property. So that republicanism was really starting to changed people's minds. Other people started to write works about this, and one of the most famous one was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and it was written in January of 1776. And in this, he says the king never had the welfare, and this he's talking about King George III, never had the welfare of his people or his subjects in mind. He's only concerned with his own exercise of power, and independence is the only answer to this problem. And he envisioned America as a dynamic, independent nation growing in population and with prosperity, with a kindly government ensuring equality. I don't know if I would call our government today kindly, but that was the goal. And he had said that all of this stuff is pretty much common sense, that your government should not infringe upon your rights. And since King George the Third did, and Parliament did, then we have the right to rebel against them. So, these pamphlets were sent all over the colonies and helped to garnish support for the revolution. And all of these things coming together meant that a break from Britain was inevitable by 1776. So with that being said, in June 7th, 1776, there was a call that there should be some formal Declaration of Independence, that there should be some document stating that that's what we plan to do. So a committee was formed, and many of the prominent names, John Adams from Massachusetts, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Robert R. Livingston from New York, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, and the famous Thomas Jefferson from Virginia were placed on that committee to create this formal Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, being the better writer of all of them, was the one in charge of writing it. So his first draft was completed on June 28, 1776. But with all things that, and you'll learn about this, with all things that come before the Congress and what have you, it has to be debated upon. So the debates start on on June 28th, and they take several days going forward. There are two parts of the Declaration. The first is the preamble, which many of you may have learned in elementary school. This justifies the revolution on the basis of natural rights, which is republicanism. And then the second part, which we really don't learn as much anymore, is the list of grievances that the colonists had against King George III, laying out all the ways that he was, infringing on rights, and justifying why we had to revolt. Excuse me. So, that being said, they did make changes to Thomas Jefferson's first draft. He had put in a section blaming slavery on the British government and blaming the slave trade on the British government. And many of them did not want any aspect of slavery being mentioned because they didn't want to make any formal declarations about that. So they took that part out. In July 2nd, 1776 is when Congress voted to end ties, and they officially declared independence on that day. And John Adams even made the comment, this is going to be the birth of the United States. But it was not until 2 days later, when the Declaration was actually signed, July 4th, 1776, when John Hancock puts his big old signature on there, and also Charles Thompson. John Hancock was the president of the Congress that time, and Charles Thompson was the secretary. So they put their two signatures on July 4th, 1776. Now, the other 56 signatures were added later. So not everyone signed on July 4th. But that's when we said that the Declaration was signed. So that's what day we celebrate as independence, July 4th, 1776. Because that's when we declared our independence, not when we received it. Because we did not fully receive independence until September 3rd of 1783. So, there's that. And there is a myth about why John Hancock signed his name so large, and it was kind of just a story. There's really no factual evidence about it, but that he signed it so large so that King George III would be able to see his signature without having to use his glasses. But There's no evidence that that's really true, but it makes for a good story. All right. So, after that, with the Continental Army was formed, the problem with going forward now is that even though we had what was considered a Continental Congress and we had an army led by George Washington, and we had some troops, but Congress had absolutely zero authority to raise money. They didn't have the authority to tax the colonists, so they had no money to pay the soldiers or to supply them. So that was one of the major issues going into the Revolution, is that we technically did not have an official government. So they asked for assistance from the colonies, but the colonies were not under any obligation to help, and many of them did not. There was no central authority. There was no creation of a treasury. They did issue what was called bills of credit, saying, hey, please give us these items or this money or whatever, and eventually we hope to pay you back. They were pretty much worthless, the bills of credit were, because there was no way that Congress could pay them back without the ability to raise money. So, going forward, the British Army at the time was the best in the world. Their navy was the best in the world. All of their military leaders were trained. All of their soldiers were trained very well. They had an amazing army and navy. The advantages for the Americans, we had home court advantage. We knew the area. George Washington was an amazing military strategist. And he just had this ability to have support for him, to get people to follow him, especially into battle. That really worked in our favor. But the three things that the British government or the British troops saw was that, first, when George Washington starts to take the tactics of hit and run tactics, trying to get the British away from the East Coast, they are not able to supply themselves as well because they're not close to the ports anymore. And that is one tactic that Washington takes, is to avoid direct engagement with the British. They use guerrilla tactics instead. Now, guerrilla tactics is pretty much where you hide and then fight. When you kind of surprise attack them. War before the American Revolution was considered a gentleman's war. What you did is you took your soldiers, both sides would take your soldiers to a big field and you would fight, and whoever, had the most soldiers left would be the winner. That's the gentleman's war, where you both meet on the same field and fight, and then so on and so forth. But after this, war is more guerrilla tactics from then forward, where you no longer meet on an equal playing field. You, especially if you're invading someone else's home, they hide and fight you and then run away and then fight you again another day. And eventually we do get support from other nations, but it takes us a little while to get that. So there were three official phases of the war. That first phase was the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and then the Battle of Bunker Hill. Those were kind of like the pre-revolution. The second phase starts in 1776. It's the traditional battles, and then the British are trying to take the capital. And then the third phase is mostly in the South with those guerrilla tactics in particular, so on and so forth. So, lots of stuff going on. In the beginning of the war, the Americans are not doing very well. The British are doing pretty good. In July of 1776, there are 34,000 British troops. They defeat the 18,000 Patriots in Long Island, and they receive New York City. That was one of their major goals, was to control New York, because they had a lot of loyalist support there. Anyway, and because it was a major port, so cut down on revenue for the Americans. So, going forward, 1776, their morale is pretty low at that point, so George Washington knows that he needs something to build up morale. So he's like, we need a victory. So on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1776, he takes his troops across the Delaware River to Trenton, New Jersey. Now, Trenton was being held by 1,500 Hessians at the time. Hessians are, because they were not home, they really had no, other than um, being paid for it, they had no reason to defend Trenton that well. So it was almost easy, if war can be easy at any point, for the Patriots to overtake Trenton. And that was a victory. It had absolutely no strategic advantage in the war at all, but it was a victory, so it made people happy, in particular the colonists. So that got more people to join the military, and others to re-enlist because of that. But the British were fighting on a kind of a two-pronged invasion. General John Burgoyne was going south from Canada. He was moving southward. General William Howe was supposed to be moving northward, and his goal was to capture Philadelphia, which was the seat of our government, our kind of pre-capital, if you will. We had several capitals before Washington, D.C. was created, by the way. Philadelphia was one. New York City was one. Boston, sort of, in a way, was one. Before we land on Washington, D.C. as our major capital. But anyway, we'll get to that point later. So Howe does get Philadelphia. He captures it on September 26, 1777. The Continental Congress has to flee. They had been there before. However, Burgoyne, his progress is slowed down because loyalists are wanting his help. And there's guerrilla fighting going on, so Burgoyne has to stop at the Hudson River. He doesn't get to keep going southward, which was the goal, so he's kind of prevented from going there. He's surrounded by 6,000 soldiers, and he only has 300 less soldiers. He had 5,700, and he was defeated by the Patriots, and that's called the Battle of Saratoga. So, why is that significant? Is that it really tips the war in our favor in that we finally show other nations that we do actually have a chance of success. So the victory at Battle of Saratoga convinces Spain and the Netherlands, known as the Dutch, to start fighting against Britain as well. And that's what they do. And also, France decides to come to our aid. They are more than willing to get back at Britain for the French and Indian War because they hope that the Americans will give them access to the land they had lost after that war. So the French not only come to our aid, they send people over to help us. One of them was the Marquis de Lafayette. He was only 19 years old at the time, but he was a very well-trained soldier, and he was, what also, like George Washington, a military strategist. So he was very good at war and very good at training our soldiers, American soldiers, and that's what he did. So he becomes leader of the American Army for that section and leads us to many victories. He also lobbies more Frenchmen to help out with the war, and they do. But because of his garnering support in France, the French Navy then starts to fight the British Navy. So what happens is that because of our victory at the Battle of Saratoga, we get other nations to divide Britain's attention. And that's what eventually helps us to win the wars. Because if Britain had only been focused on fighting the American patriots, we eventually probably would have lost. Because throughout the Revolution, we lost most of the battles. The American patriots lost most of the battles. But that's where that saying comes, you can lose the battle but win the war, is because that's what happened, is that even though we were losing battle after battle, eventually we do win the American Revolution. And it's because these other nations were dividing the attention of Britain. So they are no longer just fighting the Americans, they were fighting Spain and the Netherlands and France too. So that really helped us in the end. And they were fighting everywhere. So fighting starts to take place in Europe, America, West Indies, Mediterranean, India, other places. So divided attention and divided resources. That's what's going on at that point. But even at that point, we still have some hard times ahead of us, especially the winter of 1777 to 1778. Many of you probably heard about this. This is one of the worst points in the war because the British soldiers had already captured Philadelphia. So during that winter, they got to be in some nice, cozy homes that they had confiscated with nice stoves, keeping them warm. And they also had confiscated merchant warehouses for barracks for the troops. So they were all nice and warm and cozy inside buildings that were already there. While George Washington's troops were having to stay at Valley Forge, which was a camp of crudely erected tents mostly. Many of them had holes in them. They didn't have proper heating. The troops were starving. They were not well clothed. Many of them didn't have shoes. Their clothing was tattered at this point. So they were not doing very well during that winter. But many of the surrounding women in particular, but other colonists were trying to help with the effort. They did feed them. The women were sewing clothing for them and trying to fundraise for supplies for the military because, once again, the British troops also had a government who was supplying them with supplies that they needed, whereas the American troops did not have that. They were having to depend on fundraising that was going on, particularly by women, but also many of the major generals and soldiers like George Washington and others, and Thomas Jefferson, they were using their own wealth to fund this war. This is how much it meant to them. And Samuel Adams and John Hancock and Paul Revere and all of these people were using their own money to fund the war. And eventually, many of them almost go bankrupt because of it. But they believed so soundly in the idea of American Revolution that that's what they did. And so that pushes the war forward to between 1778 is when the British government starts to see that they may not win this war quickly and that it may take a while. So they do offer the Americans kind of their own olive branch, I guess. They say, hey, let's just go back to the way things were in 1763. You guys can do your own thing, but you'll still be part of Britain. But the Americans already have the idea of independence in mind, so they say no. But with this effort going on, and like I said, many of the generals are using their own money to fund this war. One in particular was General Benedict Arnold. And he had been a great war hero because he had fought at Ticonderoga and Saratoga and had many victories and was leading the men on. But he nearly was bankrupt because of this. So the British government offered him £10,000 in 1779 if he would just, change allegiances. So he accepted. So he becomes one of the first traitors of America, was Benedict Arnold. And his name became synonymous with being a traitor. So if you were like, if someone was a traitor, they'd be like, oh, so you're a Benedict Arnold, are you? His name was almost a curse word after that. So there were some who tried to change because they were almost bankrupt, and Benedict Arnold was one of them. But anyway, most stayed with the goal of the war. Okay, so going forward from there, the plan then was to move southward into the southern colonies because they thought that the British government thought they had more supporters down there. At the time, though, when they finally make it that far, the South is going through its own little civil war because the frontiersmen, the ones who don't own land, are fighting against the landholders. Because the landholders had too long been in charge of things and were the only ones who could vote and so on and so forth. So that fighting is going on. So when the British troops do make it down there, they realize they don't have as much support as they thought they did. So in 1779, the British get to Charleston, South Carolina, and they were led by General Sir Charles Cornwallis. He does capture Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. And his goal is to start marching northward after that through Virginia. Other things going on, 1780, the Continental Army in the South is led by Nathaniel Greene. He goes further inland, to get the British troops away from the East Coast so that they can't get their supplies anymore. And because they can't get their supplies anymore, they start to raid surrounding farms, and take food and valuables from them. So they lose a lot of their support because of that. So, 1781, though, Cornwallis is trying to make his way through the Virginia because his orders were to meet up with the other British generals. Howe was one of them, and Burgoyne was the other. Or Howe was the one he was supposed to be meeting in particular. But they were still fighting their own wars and going on from there. The British fleet was stalled in New York in particular. So Cornwallis takes his troops to the very tip of the Yorktown Peninsula, which means he leaves them with no way to get out, because he's waiting for the ships to come in, because he thinks the British ships are going to come in and they're going to put their troops on the ships and go northward and fight up there. But the ships can't get there. They're being, held up in New York. So the American troops make their way up to that peninsula, and they trap Cornwallis in, and he is forced to surrender because the French ships get there before the British ships do. So he's locked in. He has nowhere to go. So on October 19, 1781, he is forced to surrender to Washington. He doesn't actually ever meet Washington face to face for this surrender. He sends an emissary with his sword, and that sword is then given to American General Benjamin Lincoln. So Cornwallis and Washington didn't meet for the surrender, but technically he surrendered to Washington. But that surrender caused King George III to realize that he was going to lose this war, that he just did not have it in him to continue. I mean, it was 6 years long at this point. So he accepts his defeat. But it takes a while for negotiations after that. There's an American team sent over for negotiations. They go to Paris. Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams go to Paris in 1782 to talk with the French. France and Spain wanted land in the New World. So, but the problem with that is that the Americans were trying to get the best deal possible. So they negotiated with France and Britain separately, which America, the leaders of America at that time had agreed with France that they would not do that, but we did it anyway. So the treaty created by Franklin J. and Adams is favorable, one of the most favorable treaties in history, so it's called the greatest triumph in history of American diplomacy. So, Britain had wanted a favorable, generous conditions with Americans, so, and they also wanted to wedge out the French. Even though the French helped us, we kind of gave them the short end of the stick when it came all said and done. So America and Britain signed their own treaty in November 1782. Later on, but French were tired of the war at this point too, so they just wanted things to be over. So they signed this treaty on January 2nd of 1783. And then Britain, France, and Spain all signed a treaty on February 4th, 1783 to end hostilities. Now, the official end of the war was the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and that was signed on September 3rd, 1783. And in that treaty is the number one thing that was laying out was that America gets its independence. So we become the United States of America with that. Because if you don't know this, in order for a nation to become independent, to be considered a nation, at least two other major established nations have to accept that and recognize that that nation is a nation. And that's what happens with the Treaty of Paris. The second one is that America gets control of land from the Appalachian to the Mississippi River and north to the Great Lakes. The only portion that we don't control is Florida because it goes back to Spanish control. And let's see, there's supposed to be the freedom of everyone to travel the Mississippi River. That doesn't happen though because Spain controls New Orleans, and we'll get to that later. And then there's supposed to be no lawful impediment placed on British merchants seeking to recoup debts from America. That's also something that doesn't happen, but it's in the treaty. What's the significance of the war, though? Lots of people died. 25,000 died within the war. 25,000 were injured. Many more past that 25,000 were killed by disease or infection. After the war, so the total of the war is kind of unknown at this point. There is a smallpox epidemic that kills 130,000 colonists. Washington's troops had been inoculated, but it was very crude inoculation, so he in many ways spread smallpox instead of trying to prevent it, because, and that's one of the interesting things about if you learn about medicine during war times, to inoculate against smallpox for the troops. There is an actual way that they did it that was more proper, but because they didn't have access to that out on the battlefield, to inoculate his troops, what he did is you would take a knife and you would cut your arm, and if they had to have someone who was infected by smallpox. You would then take the pus from one of those sores, smallpox sores on the person infected, take the pus and then stick it in that cut so that you would hopefully build up the immunities. But what it actually did is gave that person smallpox more often than not. I mean, many did survive, but there was, even at the time of the American Revolution, a proper way to inoculate, and then later the word is used, vaccinate yourself against smallpox, but they just didn't have access to that on the battlefield. Anyway, so the war itself was longer than the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. The colonists were still divided over it because there had been loyalists, there had been rebels, and there had been people who didn't want to get involved at all. And it was a disruption to daily life. It changed politics. It created what's known as American nationalism. It changed the issue of slavery. It changed relations with Native Americans. It impacted women. And also changed religion within the United States that we became. Okay, so politics. We did finally adopt the idea that there should be natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Even though, when I've mentioned that the American Revolution technically was not as much a revolution as others, it was revolutionary because it spurred revolutions across the world. France in particular, which was a real, true revolution, but that's world history, so. Central America, South America, Haiti, a lot of different places go through their own revolutions because of the American Revolution. We get Republican democracy out of it. We also get a formal separation of church and state, that there should be no government funding of churches if not everyone actually attends those churches. And then we get the idea of America being a nation, that there are people who recognize shared qualities that set them apart from other nations, and these qualities can be political, ideological, linguistic, religious, cultural, racial, or historical. So the idea of an American nation comes out of it. And then slavery. What happens, which is interesting, after the American Revolution is that slowly slavery ends in the North. Like, it's no longer necessary because the North starts to focus on industry and manufactures instead of crops and things like that. So slavery is not needed as a labor source. Slaves had fought on both sides of the war. In the southern colonies in particular, about 50,000 slaves had run away during the confusion of the battles. Many had went to New England to live as free or Canada. And then some did stay in the South and just went to a different state now because it's no longer colonies, but a different state to live free. Other states start to create laws that allow eventual freedom of slaves, manumissions, what it's called, the eventual willingly freeing of slaves. Abolition also, other states start to pass laws outlawing slavery. And some states, especially 5 in the North, give African Americans for a short time the right to vote. It does not last though. 1790, most states outlaw the importation of slavery. Georgia and South Carolina, the only ones that continue to import slavery until the early 1800s. But the reason for that is that slavery was already established and perpetuating, in particular the South, because remember, once again, the birth rates of women were higher, so the women often survived childbirth and the children themselves survived, so they didn't necessarily need importation of slaves anymore. Native Americans' conditions got a lot worse. Not only did the battles kill many of them, the diseases, the violence, all of that pushed them. Many of them went further and further back, and some of them even went on the other side of the Mississippi River, but most of them went all the way to the Mississippi River to get away from these now American colonists. But for the most part, it was just a sign of what was to come, because the land hungriness of America was just like the land hungriness of the English colonists. So it just continued. But anyway, women had a little bit of freedom before the war, but now their freedoms are really starting to be tamped down. Women had been the ones who were instigating the boycotts and getting the clothing and the funding for the army and all this, and some of them even fought in the war. When their husbands were killed, they took up arms and finished the battles in their husband's place. But after the war, women are pretty much excluded from this idea of freedom and rights and all this other stuff. So, and even some states said that women could not own property, because when a husband died in particular, the property usually went to the wife. But in those states, it said that you had to be a property owner to vote, and they didn't want women to vote, so many of them started to outlaw the fact that women could own property. But a new idea was formed called Republican motherhood, and this was the idea that it was the women's role to stay at home and educate their sons to become good Republican citizens through education, religious adherence, and political engagement. And even though women were supposed to be ones teaching this, they were not allowed to act on this outside of the home. So they were not allowed to join the public sphere. Very limiting for women after the American Revolution. We also get the picture of Molly Pitcher, which is, a female soldier. And this was based on many women who fought in the battle. Some of them, Mary Lidwick Hayes, and the Battle of Monmouth, and Margaret Corbin, the Battle of Fort Washington. They had taken part, especially when their husbands were killed. Some of them had dressed up as men and fought in the battles, and then some of them were even spies during the war, because troops are less likely to search women, so they were often able to pass correspondence between different areas as spies. So that also took place. With religion, the separation of church and state was a big thing. So religion kind of takes a back step after the American Revolution. And there were more laws passed for religious toleration, especially for Christians, but usually only for Christians. And that there should not be public support for churches like taxes being levied in order to pay for churches. So separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson does push forward a bill in 1786 in Virginia called the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, called for the disestablishment of the Episcopal Church. There should not be any defined church. No Virginian should be compelled to go to any church or form of religious worship against their will, and all Virginians were free to profess their own opinion in matters of religion. With that being said, Thomas Jefferson then took some very interesting ideas about religion. He wrote his own Bible and stuff like that. And he lost a lot of support after he started writing his own Bible. But that's for later. Anyway, other churches were created, though. The Methodist Episcopal Church of America, Presbyterian Church of the United States, Freedom Churches opened all over, Universalist Church, Unitarian Church, pretty much a lot of different churches open. But not why these were different is because before, most of the church still taught pretty much the same principles, but now these were considered anti-dogmatic churches. So they started to stray from the old way of teaching things, of the old way of Bible instruction. And that still has continued to today. But that is pretty much Chapter 5, the American Revolution. And we'll talk more about what happens to our new fledgling nation after the war is over, because we don't get started off all that great as a new nation. But your exam is open now, so be sure to take it. If you have any questions, let me know. See you later.